The following podcast contains explicit language. You're listening to the Cinematography podcast presented by Hot Rod Cameras, a program about the art, craft, and philosophy of the moving image and the people who make it happen. Coming to you from the world headquarters of Hot Rod Cameras in Hollywood, California, are your hosts, Ben Rock and Ilya Friedman.
Hey, Ilya.
Ben, how are you?
I'm doing great. Where are you? Tell everyone where you are.
I am in an Airbnb in Las Vegas for the NAB convention, which is going on right now.
I'm so jealous. I wish I would have gone.
Try not to be too jealous. This is a marathon. It is not a sprint. And I'm only in day 2, and I'm already pretty darn haggard, burnt out.
Are you?
Yeah, it's a lot. But still, it's good. It's been good. Overall, I would say that the industry has responded and people are back to business and looking to do business, which is great.
That's great to hear. We should maybe do a deeper dive, but we'll do it maybe next week after NAB. But I'm always interested to see, like, what are the big trends out of NAB? What are they hawking that they want us to buy? What are they hawking that we actually want? All that good stuff.
I will tell you, the investor money this time around is not VR or it's not 3D. Those are both recent trends that I've predicted were giant, colossal wastes and no one should put a dime in. And there's a couple of new ones this time. Care to take a guess or a wager at what they might be?
What the new trends are this year?
Yeah.
Really small drones.
No. I'll give you one of them. AI. Lots of buzz and talk about how AI is going to transform and come in and change things. And there is definitely some, I think, legitimate thoughts about that. But it's very interesting for me to hear from people who just think of it as a buzzword and don't really understand what AI is, at least as far as this industry is concerned. So it's very interesting and fun for me to listen to some of the prophecies that people are putting forward. And I will tell you that AI is definitely a thing and people's jobs will get easier. I think editors' jobs in particular will get easier, but I don't think that editors are going to start losing their job anytime soon.
Editors' jobs have already gotten easier. I'm using AI constantly in Adobe Premiere nowadays, and every single piece of software has AI integration.
I will tell you that it's only going to continue to get easier. The AI gets better, and there's going to be more features that will have AI assists. They will assist you in your job.
And you know what that actually means? It actually doesn't mean your job gets any easier. It means that you end up being responsible for 10 times more than what an editor was responsible for just a few short years earlier.
I'm going to agree with you. I'm going to agree with you on that. There's more that is going to fall under the editor's purview, but I will say that the tasks will actually be less time consuming than they used to be.
Repetitive tasks, but then that means that here we're just going to make you edit more stuff. But I will say that already, like a lot of the clients that I have now where we would have sent stuff off for transcription, they just assume I'm going to handle it because Adobe Premiere has transcription kind of built in with AI.
For sure. Absolutely does. And I haven't been yet to the Adobe booth, but I know that they are presentations aplenty showing about some of their new and latest features coming to the Creative Cloud.
Very, very exciting. So today on the show, we have Mark H. Harris, who wrote a book called The Black Guy Dies First, Black Horror Cinema from Fodder to Oscars. It's a little different interviewing a book writer. Now, we have interviewed like Judith Weston and a few other people who've written books, but it meant that I had to actually read the book.
That's right.
I couldn't just look at the book's IMDb page and remember when I had pleasant memories of chapters in the book that I had never read. Had to actually read it, had to actually prepare. It was like actual journalism.
This has happened before. I mean, I think it's going to happen again. I've been reading a book right now for someone to interview. So yeah, I think this is great. And
I have already read the next book that I'm also going to be doing an interview about.
That's fantastic. And I did not get to be part of this interview because I'm here in Vegas. I'm not going to ask you to tell me anything about it, but I'm excited for it because I know this has been in the works for a while. And I'm really glad that it finally happened, especially because you are a little bit of a horror fan. So was it basically like a horror geek fest?
When our interview was over, we still talked for like another 20 minutes about horror stuff.
It doesn't surprise me one bit.
No, it was great to talk to Mark, and his book is awesome, and it's a good companion piece to the Shudder documentary Horror Noir that's about portrayal of people of color throughout horror history. And this book is informative, it's funny, It's well written, it's well researched, and if you're a giant horror nerd like me, in certain places it was like I realized that certain movies that I love, it's not that they're problematic or that they need to be canceled. It's more just like take a step back and acknowledge the time that it came from and how newer movies could maybe do better.
I think that's a really good attitude to take, and I try really hard whenever I'm seeing something that's dated and is a bit problematic to think that, you know what, I wish people were better back then, but there's really nothing we can do about that. All we can do is move forward. All we can do is be better now. So
very true, very true.
I hope people will be.
So talking about moving forward, let's get into our close focus, which to me is some of the weirdest entertainment news.
Agreed.
It's just weird. I mean, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just weird.
And of course, we're talking about why HBO Max is dropping HBO from their branding.
Yeah. And I mean, there's numerous articles that you can find on the internet. The one that we're referring to is written by Wilson Chapman for IndieWire. And Wilson covers sort of their reasoning for doing this super weird move. When I heard that they were dropping HBO from HBO Max, I was like, HBO is like the gold standard.
They really are.
Going all the way back, for decades, but even in the more recent memory of things like The Sopranos and The Wire. And it just seems insane to me to drop HBO from the streaming service. And a lot of the reasoning that I heard was that they're merging with Discovery, and the Discovery people don't want to feel marginalized by the HBO people, even though they are marginalized by the quality of the work on HBO.
This article specifically cites executives having a problem with The Big Bang Theory being on HBO Max. And look, I feel like there is an interface solution that they could have found to this. And I think that actually they really only need look at someone like Disney. Disney has done a really good job of having sort of like their channels inside of a channel. And National Geographic is not offended at all to be associated with Disney. It's like, these are two different worlds of things. And they give it its own button inside of Disney. So you've got some choices right off the top, including like, hey, you went to Disney. It's like, hey, you could go to this. I think that they missed an opportunity, though. I think what they really should have done is had separate apps for their different properties, and you pay one price, a bundle. You pay one price and you get access to all of them. And then if someone doesn't want it, it doesn't matter. It's included in that price. I know this sounds like going right back to cable, but it's like if you've got all these properties and you want people to watch them, what I think they are concerned about is, though, the not having just the one app to feed all of this same stuff to people who might not otherwise look for it or find it. But I'm telling you, I think you got to give people a little bit more credit. And I feel like people are not completely turned off by the idea of channels and having their own things kind of grouped together. They could have given people 5 apps or 3 apps or 2 apps or whichever they wanted to do for the price of one. And their audience would have felt like they were getting value, and they would have explored the content in all of them because they wouldn't have had the option of canceling one to get a cheaper price anyway. They totally could have done it, missed an opportunity. Think it would have been awesome.
I also feel like, can you think of any streaming service that's been renamed as many times as HBO? We had HBO Now, and then we had HBO Go, and now we have HBO Max, and then it's just going to be Max.
I think technically Go is a separate service for the subscribers, but regardless, they kind of just kept merging things together. And I just don't think the branding of Max is nearly as good as HBO. HBO is strong, and they could screw up the programming in HBO big time, because let me tell you, the reputation is so strong. They've had misses. They don't want to talk about certain shows that they've had that weren't exactly, fan favorites.
John from Cincinnati.
I was going to say vinyl, but really there's quite a few. They have had quite a few misses over the years, but that doesn't matter. HBO is beloved and for.
And by the way, you wouldn't watch vinyl and be like, piece of crap.
Not at all.
You would just watch vinyl and be like, yeah, it just didn't connect. That happens.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
And Max, of course, Max conjures up Cinemax, which, nothing against Cinemax. They had good shows like Banshee, but they're mostly known for softcore pornography from like 1980 through like 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's fair. So yeah, I think that it's another misstep. I kind of feel like people got used to HBO Max just the same way they got used to Disney Plus, and they got used to so many other of these services that kind of like added a little suffix and said it's a new thing. to change it after people were used to it, and now also dropping the iconic HBO in favor of Max, which I even think Cinemax for a while did refer to themselves as Max. I certainly know that the program guide for like my local cable service shortened it to Max. So I don't know.
It reminds me a little bit, and maybe this proves that they're right to do this, but it kind of reminds me of when Sci-Fi Channel rebranded themselves as SYFY, which they still are, and it made a lot of people go like, "What's that?"
I think that Sci-Fi rebranded because they needed a rebrand, and I think that HBO Max is rebranding and doesn't need a rebrand. But
they
okay.
just rebranded. HBO Max has been out for 2 years?
Yeah.
It'd be like if Netflix rebranded every 2 years, and you're like, okay, like to me as a consumer, as someone who's going to potentially spend money on a monthly subscription to this, it makes me go like, are they going to cancel this? Is this going to go away? And we already know and have talked about on the show how like HBO is just disappearing some of their shows, like Westworld, which completed its run less than a year ago and got taken completely off the service.
Yeah, it really makes me feel like they've got plans for other apps that they want to sell subscriptions to, that they want to charge money for individually, and they want to fill those with content. They wanted to take stuff that they had in one place and stick it somewhere else. And like, I was actually in the process of watching a series called Infinity Train. Infinity Train's gone. I can't find that anywhere. It's just
Infinity
gone.
my ass. They should have called it Finite Train. That would have been way more.
Finite Train would have been appropriate. So.
Oh man.
But yeah. Anyway, it is.
All
what
I know
is
I'm not paying for the blue check mark on Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah. Nor should you. Well, hey, why don't we get to the interview with Mark Harris?
Here we go.
The Cinematography Podcast Interview.
All right, so our guest today is Mark Harris, who co-wrote a book called The Black Guy Dies First, Black Horror Cinema from Fodder to Oscar, with Robin R. Means Coleman as well. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
I think this might even be a good place to really start. I saw a lot of annoyed people on Twitter who were complaining about the dearth of Oscar nominations for Nope. And as a fan of Jordan Peele and a fan of horror movies, I'm just used to horror movies getting completely overlooked at every award ceremony. And in fact, Get Out to me is kind of the exception to that, where a horror movie was like so standing on the nerve of where we were as a society that it was unavoidable to talk about it. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is really the ugly stepchild of Hollywood, really. I mean, it's the genre that I think is most looked down on with disdain in terms of, awards and critical appeal. So I'm like you. I never expected Nope to get any nominations or anything like that. The only reason I might think it might is just because Jordan Peele has a history. And so, the name recognition might convince some people to throw him in there. But I wasn't too surprised. I did allow myself to get a little hopeful in the last couple of years with a movie like Us, or there's another movie called His House, a British haunted house movie that I thought was exceptional. And I thought, okay, this is really well made. It has good gravitas. It has good drama. It's scary. It has a message. And I thought, oh, maybe Hollywood will recognize this and, kind of push it through. But no, it never got anything. So I'm just used to it now. So, anything that comes is gravy to me. So I think Hollywood and people in general still, when they think of horror, they think of cheesy slasher movies. And so I think that kind of stigma has just ridden with it over the years, and it's hard to get rid of.
So let's go and hop into your book, Black Guy Dies First, which you co-wrote with Robin R. Means Coleman. It's a fascinating read. It's really cool. And as a horror fan and a horror filmmaker myself, there was a lot of me reading it and being like, yeah, God. And I don't know if you mentioned it in the book, but I always remember there was a ripoff of John Carpenter's The Thing that came out in the late 80s called Leviathan, and Ernie Hudson was in it, and he almost makes it to the end. and I even remember I was in high school seeing him get killed, and I'm like, why do you got to kill off Ernie Hudson? Couldn't he? He fought so valiantly. So what was it that made you want to write this as a book and kind of put all these, I'm going to say a lot of them are cliches, put them out there in a very entertaining, I should say, compendium like this?
I mean, this was kind of a dream project to me. It's usually a culmination of my life as a horror fan, basically. I mean, I've watched horror since I was, 10 or 12 years old. And regardless of genre, I've always paid attention to the Black characters, because when I was growing up in the 80s, there were so few of them on TV and in movies. I remember literally if a Black character came on TV, I'd be like, there's a Black person on TV, there's a Black person on TV, running through the house. So it was really, a rare occasion and something that I really paid attention to regardless of the genre. And so when I got into horror, it really, stood out even more, because the Black character, whenever there was a Black character, typically they would end up dead because, they're not the star. So they got to go basically in horror movies. So, I mean, this book really is a culmination of my whole experience. I started a website called Black Horror Movies in 2005. Because I kind of got interested in like who's tracking and who's documenting these instances of Black people in horror movies and Black people making horror movies and that sort of thing. And I couldn't find anything. So I thought, hey, who better to do it than me? So I just started my own website, and then I started tracking more diligently the portrayals of Black characters in horror. So when this opportunity came up, it was, like a godsend to me. The book has been done for a long time before it ever got published. So,
oh, really?
It's really been a long time coming. I'm really glad it's finally out there. Yeah.
As I'm reading it, and again, I'm a horror fan, so I want to read anything that's an analysis of horror, but I was thinking about the version of this book you could write about romantic comedies or mainstream dramas. And, to me, and what kept occurring to me, and I'm curious about your thoughts about this, is like horror is, when it's done well, in my opinion, very deeply transgressive. And so it's often, because it's transgressive, it's often progressive, like it's often taking a political stance not accepted by the mainstream. Whereas like rom-coms and a lot of regular old dramas are often like maintaining status quo. So is it important to hold horror to a higher standard when it comes to representation and diversity in the way it is handled than it is to hold mainstream films? Or is it maybe because it's like the tip of the spear of a genre where like, if this stuff is going to get explored, it's going to probably be in genre science fiction, horror, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that horror tends to push boundaries, not just because of the edgy material, but also because not much is expected of it from the mainstream. Like, people aren't like, oh, what's horror going to do next? Or, it's looked down upon, so people don't really expect much from them. So I think they have the freedom to kind of explore new things. And so I think in horror, there is a tendency to go down different routes. And I think the thing about horror that's interesting is it kind of reflects society's fears and anxieties. So I think when it comes to race, it helps to analyze horror specifically, because it is something that, whether it's intended as a statement or not, it tends to be a statement. Even the cheesiest slasher or whatever, I think can reveal something about what people feared at the time that the movie was made. So, the Elm Street movies, or you could kind of say was a fear of the invasion of the insular nature of the suburbs and stuff like that, kind of fear about something coming in and attacking this perfect environment. So yeah, definitely horror can be fruitful in terms of, analyzing what people are fearing. And so race is kind of one of the biggest touchstones in America in terms of fear and anxiety. So I think it really is something that could be valuable to kind of analyze race in terms of the horror genre.
You mentioned it in the first chapter of the preface, Night of the Living Dead. George Romero, whose politics were extraordinarily progressive, cast Dwayne Jones as the lead in Night of the Living Dead. But still, spoiler alert for those who, you've had about 53 years to watch it, still doesn't quite make it to the end of the movie. He's the last one, but he doesn't make it. But I feel like Romero, he would cast people like him and Ken Foray in his stuff, and would often have somebody of color and also a woman in the leads of his movies. But how does that get bent towards the cliches? Because I feel like you look back at some of that and some of it falls into cliche. Sometimes the cliche is just people copying something that somebody else did that worked. Sometimes it's revealing a deeper issue in the writing. Well, where do you think that happens?
I mean, Night of the Living Dead, I think, was a real anomaly in terms of, it was so far ahead of its time. Like, it would have been ahead of its time 20 years later, I think.
Agreed.
I mean, I think I remember watching it when I was probably 12 or so in the mid 80s and being blown away that there was this black character in the lead of this movie that seemed like ancient to me. But even in the 80s, it still would have been like, wow, there's a black hero in this movie. So, yeah, I mean, I think that movie is really so much of an outlier. It's hard to really put it in the line of the history of black characters dying, because the black character dying trope is really a form of marginalization of the black characters. You know, they're not the heroes in the story. So in horror movies where there's a bloodlust and a demand for a body count, if you're not the hero, you end up getting killed. So that's really kind of the gist of what we're talking about in the book in terms of ways that black characters have been marginalized historically. You know, they've been put into these roles, the best friend or the authority figure or the voice of reason, somebody who's not the hero who can easily be discarded and it won't affect the storyline very much. But we did start with Night of the Living Dead in the book and Spider Baby as kind of a way to show the opposite ends of the spectrum. Spider Baby was really like the prototypical black guy dying first. It had Mantan Moreland, who just pops up, and then within 5 minutes of the opening credits, he's dead. He doesn't even have a name for his character. He just has a few lines and he's just chopped right off the bat. So we kind of use those two to show the range of how things were and how they could be, you know, because the Spider Baby is the bottom of the barrel in terms of black representation. And then Night of the Living Dead kind of was so far ahead of its time. It was really an indication of how things could be. Even though the black character did die, he was the hero. He was kind of a forerunner to today's heroes, like in Get Out and that sort of thing. So,
and also him dying in that movie isn't special. Everybody dies. All the characters in that movie are dead by the end. So.
Exactly. And he had the most poignant death, I guess you could say. He really
it's the one that hurt the most. Like, you feel this guy working to stay alive and save all these people all night, only to just be shot by basically a mob. So a real life example of a situation here. I saw Horror Noir on Shudder, which you're in, and it's a wonderful documentary. I recommend it to everybody. And then shortly thereafter, I was casting a project. It was for Audible. That's a fully narrative, full cast project. And as I think what is an improvement in our industry, the discussion with the executives came up about diversity in the roles. And the lead character was African American. One of the other leads was African American. And there was a character who gets killed who kind of sacrifices herself about 2/3 of the way through the story. And it was brought up, and I have a genuine dilemma, and I'm curious what you think about this, which is we floated the idea of having an African American or Latino or, you know, not a white person in that role. And then it was like, after watching Horror Noir, I was like, I don't want the person who sacrifices themselves to be that. Like, I feel like it falls into cliche. But then I have the opposite feeling, which is I'm depriving someone of even being considered for a job now. Like, you know, this is work for an actor. And in Horror Noir, they talk about this a lot. Like, this is good. This is solid work. You're getting a role in the craft, and it's going to get a huge, you know, national release. It's good for your career. It's good for your wallet right now. As a filmmaker and a white guy, how should I be thinking about this stuff so that I'm doing as much good by my choices as I possibly can?
Wow. There's a lot of pressure on me now. I'm glad to hear that the discussion is being had at all. I mean, which is good, because I'm not an insider at all, so I don't really know what conversations are being had. So it's good to know that that's even being considered. I mean, I would say in your situation, definitely, since the protagonist and some other leads are people of color, I mean, I would definitely not feel bad about having a sacrificial person of color as well. So, I mean, I think that definitely balances that out in terms of that. I mean, it's hard to say because, you know, it's hard to take one project individually and say this will make a difference or whatever. It's really a more of an industry-wide thing where it's like you got to kind of have more of a systemic change and a systemic conversation to be had. But, you know, each project adds up and it does bleed into the whole industry. So, I mean, I think it is something good to be talked about. And I think like I said, in your situation, I think you're good in terms of if you have the black lead and I wouldn't think twice about having a black person.
Like the negative reviews of the end product on Audible, the ones that are negative, and most of the reviews are positive, but the ones that are negative complain about it being woke. So
so that's that's the code word for anything that's not white now, or white, straight, cisgender. It's just woke. Just diversity is woke now, apparently. So I wouldn't take that as a real complaint.
So getting back to your book, The Black Guy Dies First, it feels like a lot of what you're cataloging, making a little bit of fun of, I mean, you're telling us in a fun way, are kind of a list of cliches that, are inaccurate portrayals that have just fallen into cliche. Could you go through some of the other cliches besides The Black Guy Dies First, some of the other tropes that these movies tend to fall into?
Yeah, I mean, Hollywood has found ways to pigeonhole black characters into these roles that any way to avoid them being the hero, basically. So, I mean, you have things like, the best friend, the authority figure who's kind of like the cop who's the hero comes to, and it's like, oh, there's a killer out there, and the cop doesn't believe him, that sort of thing. You have like the voice of reason, like somebody who's telling them, don't go in those woods, or that sort of thing. You have the sacrificial Negro, which kind of we've talked about just now, is just, the person whose job it is to just basically say, save yourself. And even if it really doesn't make any sense, they kind of step in the way. And even though they could run away with the hero, they decide to stick around and take a machete to the head or something. So there's also the magical Negro, which is a favorite of Stephen King's, black characters who have this kind of supernatural ability, but typically they use it just to help the white main character succeed in their goals.
Yeah, you bring up this. I mean, I know it's more a Kubrick thing than a Stephen King thing, but in The Shining, and it hurts my heart because I love The Shining, but I recognize everything you're saying about the way they handle the Scatman Carruthers character in that movie, and it almost seems unfair,
No, and I mean, I love the movie too. I mean, it's kind of a weird dichotomy because I do love a lot of these movies, but I still can recognize the flaws and the tropes that they're leaning into. So yeah, it's Scatman really. They did him dirty in that one. He went through a whole lot to get there, and he lasted about 2 minutes once he got there.
And the thing about The Shining too is like literally only two people die in The Shining, him and Jack Nicholson. Like those are the only two people you actually see get killed in the movie.
Yeah. The only ray of light really is that he did indirectly save them because he brought the snowcat that they used to get out at the end. So I guess you could say that he did save the day in that way. So R.I.P. Scatman.
But yeah, his death does kind of seem almost superfluous in the story. Like if he hadn't died, if it had been like you said in your book, if it had been like the book, he could have been a heroic figure. He could have been part of saving Wendy and Danny. Yeah.
I mean, I think we mentioned in the book, there was some discussion where I think Kubrick or somebody decided that there needed to be somebody to be killed. And he was really the only person to be killed other than Jack.
You also point out that he had to do it like 25 times and land on the hard floor. And then they didn't even use the shot of him landing on the hard floor. And he was like in his like 60s or 70s at the time.
Yeah. Poor guy.
But,
he seemed like a really good sport about it, I think.
So as I was reading the book, I like some of the ones that came up to me were like The Shining, The Serpent and the Rainbow, Angel Heart. You kind of talk about the tropes that a lot of these movies fall into. And these are also movies that I just love. Now, I know that they're from another time, even though it doesn't feel like another time because they came out when I was, a teenager or younger. But like, I remember them coming out. I remember them being contemporary. But like, how do you square the circle of looking at a movie like that and being like, this is full of tropes or has tropes, potentially racist tropes? And I feel like in the case of The Serpent and the Rainbow, especially, like Wes Craven was making a real statement about tyranny. And you bring up some of the other movies that he did, like The People Under the Stairs, which it's like, I feel like a lot of Wes Craven's movies, if you scratch the surface, there's like something about economic or racial or societal justice that Wes Craven was always working on. But in so doing, he still has kind of a pretty cliche voodoo bad guy in The Serpent and the Rainbow.
Yeah. And I'm a Wes Craven fan. I love his movies. I enjoyed Serpent and the Rainbow and The People Under the Stairs and everything. But, I think it is still important to, even for movies we love, I think it's still important to kind of recognize some of these things that are kind of endemic in the industry as a whole. So it's, we can point it out and recognize it for the future. Even a movie like People on the Stairs, which was really revolved around these black characters and the wrong that is being done to them by these slumlords, the racist slumlords. The portrayal of the black home life was still left a little bit to be desired. And, the sister was a prostitute with babies, and the place where they lived in, even though it was supposed to be like, a slum, it was really just like some otherworldly thing with like feral dogs and like just all kinds of ridiculous stuff. So it is still important, I think, to call things like that out. And stuff like Candyman, which I loved, and I enjoyed the original Candyman. I watched it in the theater. I was scared to death. Mm-hmm. But, it is still good to point out, that there are some issues with, the portrayals of the urban community in there. Like, it was kind of like this urban jungle it was kind of the modern equivalent of the Tarzan movies of the 50s or the 30s or whatever, where, the intrepid white explorer was going into this urban, this dangerous black territory with these savages. And so that's kind of still the vibe you kind of get in Candyman, and the whole imagery of a black man lusting after a white woman is kind of fraught with a history. And so it's important to remember the context of we're in America, and that we do have these histories that you kind of have to be mindful of. And so when you're doing these movies, you kind of have to always keep things in mind and try to avoid the potential minefield, which I understand is really hard to do. And I know this day and age, you are mindful of trying to, being canceled, quote unquote, and that sort of thing. But I do think the awareness is really something that we need to have and to keep going.
It's getting better now, but there has traditionally been a lack of diversity behind the camera, i.e. writers, directors, cinematographers. Mm-hmm. And on our podcast, I think the first time we interviewed a woman, I asked her questions about like being a woman trying to break into cinematography. And I realized afterwards it really wasn't her story. And Ilya and I had a serious conversation about it. Like, let's not, if somebody brings it up in an interview, we'll talk about it. If they don't bring it up, we'll never bring it up because it should be the norm. And we shouldn't be like asking you what about your background made it hard for you, because obviously this business is difficult for literally everybody. Nobody gets a free ride here. Mm-hmm. But like we are seeing a rapid increase, I'd say, over the last 10 years in diversity behind the camera. But we've had people like Ernest Dickerson, who did he did Demon Knight. Which you talk about. I love Demon Knight.
Yeah, me too.
But you bring up Demon Knight and some of the characters as falling into the tropes, even though, it basically ends with Jada Pinkett winning out. Mm-hmm. But what about that? Like, what about the lack of diversity traditionally? And did Jordan Peele really bust that open? I know that he's doing everything in his power, in his position in the industry, to give opportunities to people now who may not have gotten them before, simply because of their ethnicity. But talk a little bit about that if you could.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to increase diversity in front of the camera is to increase diversity behind the camera, because when you have Black people writing, directing, I think they will kind of keep things more in line in terms of opening up the opportunities for other characters of color to come through. And I think that Jordan Peele definitely has opened a lot of doors. I mean, I think Hollywood's kind of a creature of the moment. So yeah, anything that seems like it works, they will run with it. So, I mean, with Get Out, it was a runaway smash. And so I think they were like, oh, okay, let's go in this direction. It remains to be seen if they will continue in that direction. But I think at least for the time being, they have allowed for some more Black leads in genre movies, in all genres really. Yeah. But in horror as well. I think there's still a level of discomfort in terms of putting out really major, big horror movies with Black leads. I think a lot of the ones that have come out have been streaming ventures on Hulu and Netflix and Amazon, that sort of thing, which I think is a lot less risky for the studios to do. So,
is that a squeamishness about Black people in leads, or is that a squeamishness about horror movies, or is that like the Venn diagram where they converge?
Probably a little bit of both. But I do think that historically there's been an excuse not to have a lot of black leads in a movie because it makes it a quote unquote black movie. And then, you know, I think a lot of times they'll say, oh, black movies don't do well internationally, so we can't really put a whole lot behind this.
I've had a producer say that to my face for this movie that I directed.
Yes.
It was funny because they were arguing that to me, and we ended up, our lead was Carlos Bernard. So, you know, we ended up with a person of color in the lead, but it was still like, it was explained to me when I was making the case for who I thought should be the one of the actors who we should consider for the hero. That exact case was made to me. And I still think about it today. You gotta be fucking kidding me, man. Like, you know, firstly, it doesn't need to make that much money overseas if it does really well here, but also like, genre movies, traditionally, like a lot of the ones that work, they're cast with unknowns. You don't know who the actors are. Like, you know, who knew who Heather Langenkamp was before Nightmare on Elm Street? Or you could go on and on and on. Like, the cast is usually not the contingent thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you make a movie that's good enough, I mean, it will translate to wherever. And I think a lot of the big blockbusters now that have like people of color in the leads, from, you know, The Rock or Vin Diesel or people like that, I think that is kind of at least hopefully helping to open up Hollywood's minds in terms of, you know, maybe we can have a little more diversity in our cast and still succeed in Afghanistan or wherever they're releasing the movies.
Spain.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that's the thing that I've read that was like the go-to excuse for a lot of years in terms of not having black leads in these movies. So yeah.
Well, I feel like I've used up a lot of your time, but I did want to talk about one thing that you talk about in the book that I thought was hilarious, which were bad rap songs in the end credits of horror movies, and how and when that kind of came to be. Although, like the Freddy one, I mean, they're all goofy and catchy. Like they're not, I don't know that they're to be taken seriously as music. But I guess what underlies that is like there's kind of a worship of black culture, and you get a certain amount of credibility by co-opting it to a degree by doing things like having a rap song in the end credits or whatever. So what is the balance there? Why would the same group be like marginalized, but also kind of like, hey, look at how cool I am. I like the Fat Boys, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the story of black culture in the US a lot. You know, it's like there's the love for what black people can bring, but not necessarily a love for black people themselves, you know? So I think it was an interesting phenomenon to me because it definitely stood out in my mind, like from, I guess it just grew out of like the rise in popularity of hip hop in like the late 80s. That seemed to be like the go-to thing when they wanted to cap off a movie with like a fun song or whatever. It's like, oh, what's fun right now? Let's bring in a rapper, you know? And a lot of times they were terrible. Arguably, most of the time they're terrible.
Yeah.
But
actually, probably my favorite is LL Cool J's Deep Blue Sea song at the end. My hand is like a shark's fin or something.
Yeah, or my hat is like a shark's fin, I think, which was
is that what he says?
I think, which is I don't know what that means. I just like, are you underwater swimming in a hat? What I don't know, but it's.
I always thought it was my hand, but you know, like I have to admit, I haven't done a deep dive into that one, literally.
But yeah, they were awful. I think the only one that I remember liking was the end of The People Under the Stairs, where it had like a song by Redhead Kingpin called Do the Right Thing. And that was just like, I remember it because it was actually a popular song at the time. It was already a song that was doing well. So, I mean, I remember thinking, oh, okay, that's like a real hip hop song at the end. Okay. But yeah, it was like just something that really stood out in my mind. And obviously for years I kept it in my brain and then brought it out for the book and just kind of went through some of the worst offenders.
Well, I know it's not really a horror movie, but I also often go to MC Hammer's Addams Family theme.
Yeah, that was something.
So before we go, where do you see the direction of this heading? Maybe what are some of the cliches that we're falling into now, the tropes you're starting to see emerge in the, let's say, the last 5-6 years?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that as much as I loved Get Out and its impact, I think we have to be wary of the risk of everybody trying to repeat Get Out and being the next Get Out. And I think that's kind of what Hollywood, like I said, Hollywood goes with what's hot. So I think they kind of think Get Out worked. So what's the next Get Out? And so I think we've had some movies that maybe have tried to shoehorn kind of some social commentary into things where they didn't need to be. I think the key to continuing Black horror and having it be a real lasting part of the horror genre is to have diversity within the storytelling. Not everything can be Get Out. You can have stupid, goofy black slasher movies, you can have, other kinds of horror movies, just like you can have the same kind of range within, quote unquote, white horror movies. So I think the key is kind of to help show the range of blackness, wherever it may land on the spectrum. It might be something that has a lot of social commentary. It might be something that doesn't. So that's really the thing I think we need to kind of keep in mind to help things going. Because if everything tries to be the next Get Out, and then a couple of them fail in a row, then Hollywood's going to be like, oh, done with that. Let's move on to something else. And so yeah.
That's what I appreciate about Jordan Peele is I feel like Jordan Peele with each one of his movies has just taken on completely different subject matter. Like none of them, they all feel like they are made by him. They all have I couldn't tell you what it was, but there's something about them that feel like one of a piece, but none of them are the same story.
Yeah, he's been great. He's wildly imaginative, and he really, expands beyond what you think will happen. I mean, you can't really predict what his movies are going to be about at all. And even as you're watching them, you're not quite sure where it's going to go.
Yeah, I feel like he's one of our greatest living directors right now. And I'm just excited that he seems to have chosen horror as the thing to go into, because it's made horror feel like a more legitimate pursuit for me anyway. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, there's a lot of good horror movies that have come out in recent years by like new directors, and I'm just like afraid that they're gonna like abandon horror and be like, oh, I proved my point, now I'm a real director, I'm gonna move on to something else. So I'm glad, I really appreciate him sticking to the genre.
I actually feel like that's one of the, like growing up, I think probably like you, I read a lot of Fangoria. I don't know if you did, but even today, here's the new issue of Fangoria sitting right on my desk. And to me, being a horror filmmaker was, like you'd see John Carpenter and Wes Craven, David Cronenberg, like it seemed like a job you could have. These people were making this stuff, and you would see people who kind of moved in and made a horror movie so they could show that they could make a bunch of money, and then they'd move on to something else. But I feel like more people are kind of seeing the value in genre now. And also, when I was growing up, there was kind of a dude bro, a white dude bro-ness around horror movies, and horror movies were very conservative leaning. I remember Stephen King wrote an article about how, why did conservatives hate horror movies? They have the exact same ethics. Like in a Friday the 13th movie, if you smoke dope or you listen to music or you're not nice to your parents, you get killed. It's only the purest person who makes it to the end of those movies. But I feel like we're in a different moment now, and it feels a little bit less, I'm just going to say gross than, when I was a kid. I mean, there are always people like Sam Raimi or whatever who I thought were just doing phenomenal, mind-blowing work, or Stuart Gordon. But I feel like now it's more of an acceptable artistic statement. Do you find that to be the case?
Yeah, I think horror is probably, of all genres, I think it's the most self-aware of its tropes and its tendencies. So I think that it really analyzes itself, and it kind of can see, oh, these are the expected ways which we'll go with this story. These are, we have to have these beats and this sort of thing. But, you can also use it to be like, oh, because this is the way where it's expected to go, let's go this way. Let's kind of challenge things. And like you said, it's a transgressive genre. So, I mean, I think it can challenge itself and kind of say, oh, we're going to do things differently. Or the heroine or the hero doesn't have to be this paragon of virtue. They can be kind of a sloppy person who's got issues. So yeah, I still love the genre. It's still fun. It's still my favorite thing to watch. So keep going.
Well, cool. Well, thank you, Mark. Before we go, where can people find you online if they're looking for your stuff online or they want to interact with you?
I'm at, my site is blackhorrormovies.com, and I'm on Twitter now and then at Blackula is my handle. So
nice.
Yes, I grabbed that early on.
That was a good move. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
All right, so that was Mark Harris. It's not often that I interview anyone who has even heard of Alien Raiders. As on my Zoom, there's an Alien Raiders poster behind me, and the fact that he was like, I saw Alien Raiders, it was like, you what now? I was very excited.
Nice.
And now, short ends.
So, Ilya, it is that time for our patent pending short ends segment. I can only imagine how many obsessions you are having being at NAB right now, but what is your obsession?
Wow, I think I have to say that virtual stages are probably my obsession.
You talking about like LED volume kind of stages?
LED volumes, yes, and sort of the virtual stages that made popular by like Mandalorian. That is definitely something that has captured the venture capitalists' money for this industry and is definitely a thing right now. And I will tell you, although I am only on the fringes of this and I have enough knowledge and experience about the virtual stages, the LED walls to be dangerous, what I can tell you is that this is not going to go away the way that like 3D and VR and some of the stuff I mentioned just at the beginning of the show were fads that went away. LED walls are something that have existed for rock concerts and live events for quite some time. The pixel pitch, or how close the individual LEDs are, getting smaller and smaller and smaller. When you combine that with clever production skills, pretty much means that you can put a couple of actors in front of a camera and make them anywhere in the world or out of the world, depending on what you want, if you've planned appropriately. And what that means is that you could be in a basement somewhere, or even as I saw at NAB today, the back of a semi-truck, which has been converted into a LED volume stage. So you could literally drive a car into the back of a truck and do your driving shots, or you could do all kinds of different things. It is the stage will come to you in the future, or you will go to the stage. And if you've planned appropriately, you can sufficiently fake locations from anywhere real or imagined, which is amazing.
I mean, I remember when we talked to Greg Fraser about The Mandalorian, that was something that kept coming up to me, is that The Mandalorian, when I saw it, I didn't know, when season 1 came out, I didn't know anything about this technology. And I've recently, my son we were watching all the Star Wars movies, and one day he insisted that we needed to watch something with Baby Yoda in it, because Baby Yoda... Man, the kids love Baby Yoda. So I was like, is Mandalorian too violent? I watched a little bit of it. I'm like, it's no more violent than Return of the Jedi. We'll just go for it. And so we started watching it, and you have to give Greg Fraser all the credit in the world. When it's shot right, you cannot tell that any chicanery is going on, and it's so clever and so amazing and transportive. When it's done wrong... and I'm looking at certain episodes of Book of Boba Fett, which used it not as well, in my humble opinion. When it's done wrong, I feel like it screams out to you that it looks like old rear screen projection. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm sure the technology and the techniques and stuff. Like I remember when we talked to Abe Martinez just a few months ago, he was talking about some of the things he was doing with LED walls and stuff like that, even on location, like the kinds of stuff you can do with them. And it's pretty amazing. But when I realized what they were doing with The Mandalorian, it was like, it is a humongous game changer. Now, the ones you're seeing, are they utilizing Unreal Engine to create the images that are being rear projected? Are they using a sensor on the camera to create the proper parallax and all that stuff?
Yes and no. There's various forms of this, and there's different ways that you can do it without necessarily investing in Unreal Engine and going down that path. Unreal Engine, though very popular, it is, of course, highly possible to do that. But there's quite a bit of a simpler version where it is more like rear projection that is being employed. And there's sort of some hybrid stuff too, because if you wanted to do it with a green screen, it's kind of like you just turn on the knob to green, and now you've got the mobile green screen wherever you go as well. There's all kinds of cool tricks you can do.
Well, even I think Greg said that, like, for some of the robot kind of characters or whatever, if they needed a green screen just on part of the screen, they could just make a little green square that went around somebody's head, and that was that. I see the convenience and like what we're going to be able to do with it. And obviously LED screens are only going to get better and better, and the pixel pitch will get, smaller. Is that what we're looking for?
Yeah, exactly. Smaller pitch, higher resolution. And as they get closer and closer and closer to what essentially something I think we've talked about on the show before was, sort of this NHK idea from decades ago of like, they could make these incredibly high resolution trompe-l'oeil effects where, a screen fools the eye, makes you think it's a window. If you can do that for this sort of thing too, if you get it down and then the price continues to come down, essentially anyone could have this sort of thing in their home or their basement or their bedroom. It'd be pretty nice if you've got that basement office to be able to, flip a switch and one of your walls suddenly feels like a window and you're looking out at Waikiki or wherever you might want to imagine you are, on the moon, on a desert isle. It's up to you. It's
the exact same view that I have, but facing a different direction. Like,
actually, it'd be really cool. It's like, oh yeah, my neighbor used to have a tree there, and they chopped it down, but with my virtual wall, the tree's back.
Just mess with
anyway.
people. Anyway,
so
yeah.
Ben, what's your short end this week? What are you all about?
My short end is kind of a slightly delayed thing. I keep wanting to bring it up week to week, and I haven't done it yet. And that's that I'd say it was probably a month and a half ago, Midjourney came out with version 5.
Oh.
And Midjourney is the AI art, for generative art thing of my personal choice. I say Midjourney is the best of the bunch. There's Stable Diffusion, there's Dolly, there's Blue Willow, and there's always new ones. Midjourney is just bonkers great. And, the complaint before was it was hard to create consistent characters. And also hands. It would always mess up hands and make hands would have 27 fingers and they'd be pointing in wrong directions. And they would all look like real fingers, but they didn't make any sense. And it's still a little off sometimes. And there's still sometimes a bit of an uncanny valleyness to it. But I will say that recently for a pitch deck that I was putting together, I didn't use AI art exclusively, but I did a bunch of Midjourney stuff to create images of the main characters. So I could say, like, here are the main characters, and then pull IMDb kind of headshots of the various actors that you're thinking of. I would say, every day there are more professional, realistic uses for this stuff. And there are things where, like there's the complaint that we're putting artists out of business, but it's like, to put a pitch deck together, I never would have hired an artist at all. I just would have gone to like Pitch Deck, which I still do, and pulled some images, or I might have just done a Google image search because I'm not distributing it and making money from it. It's just an internal document. And so having tools like this to be able to kind of create concept art, if you're going to do real work, you're still going to hire a real concept artist. It's not a precise enough tool yet. And I'm not expecting it to become precise enough. Precision isn't really what it does. It's not a precise enough tool to be supplanting real artists when you need real artists, but in a lot of places where you're like, wow, I wish I had a workable sketch of X, Y, or Z. It really is some pretty amazing stuff. And also it's just good, weird fun for, goofing around and having it ideate. For me, it's usually something that's like super disgusting that would, creep people out. Like I did one, I posted it to my Instagram recently of happy kids playing with oversized wasp larvae. Yeah, it's super gross. And, I didn't tell Midjourney to do this, but they had some of the kids eating them. And I'm like, hey, you go Midjourney. And the kids look very real. Like it's getting realer and realer. And I feel like, maybe by the time we get to Midjourney 6 or 7, will we ever cross the uncanny valley? I don't know. But it's interesting to see what it can do. And I think that ChatGPT and some of the text-based AI stuff has been kind of hogging the spotlight a little bit. And I feel like generative art tickles my fancy way more. Like I just think it's a very interesting thing to do. And our friend Gabe Leonard, who's a very legitimate oil painter, like he's a fine art painter, he uses it all the time. He loves using it. And he said that he'll have an idea for a painting and he'll run that idea through it and he'll see sort of like the 10 bad versions of his idea. And then he'll go, it enables him to open his mind to think of a newer, fresher way to do it.
I think that's going to be true of artists of all types and continuing to use AI into the future. I talked to someone today who has to write a lot of copy, and they do not ever use ChatGPT for the copy, but they will often use it to ideate and to organize thoughts and to try to figure out directions. And then they write the whole thing themselves. But it's like, the tools exist out there to try to spark originality, spark creativity, and to essentially create your own, feedback loop. So it's like, hey, you've got an idea, you want to get some sort of opinion. It's more or less instantaneous, or it's very, very short turnaround. Yeah. And if you want to get humans, that means sometimes you've got to then wait for humans who have the time to pay it proper attention.
And you have to pay them money.
Exactly, and get to give you the feedback. So.
Who I think is maybe a little screwed, but probably still not, is lawyers. Because I feel like you could make an AI write up a contract really fast, but then, you'd still want a real lawyer to go through it. Like, I wouldn't trust a contract that was made up by ChatGPT.
Definitely not. Oh my God, that sounds like a terrible, terrible idea. That sounds reckless.
But it sounds like if you're a lawyer and you're going to spend your whole day writing up a contract for something, and you can sort of generate a first draft of it with ChatGPT and then go through and tweak it, it might take some of the dummy work out of it, some of the repetitive stuff. I mean, I feel like much like with editing, it's AI takes the repetitiveness out of it. So if you're a lawyer, it might mean that you can churn out twice as many contracts in half the time or something. I don't know. Everyone who thinks that we're all going to be replaced with AI, I do start to wonder, well, what do you think people will do all day long? Like, if they're not going to write movies and make movies and be lawyers and write articles and stuff, like, what are humans going to do anymore? Are we just going to work at restaurants? Maybe
I think what is likely is that the work will become more egalitarian, in that you might not need 11 years of schooling for certain things, or you might not need a certain amount of training if you are good at using certain prompts and good at using certain ways.
Yeah.
And also that these networks continue to develop, and so that you really can rely on the results, because right now I would say the results from many of these things are unreliable. But at the same time, when it's something subjective like art, you might say it is 100% reliable. It completely depends on if it's something that is fact and truth-based or something that is subjective. And so we will see what happens. We will all be paying close attention, and it will impact our lives. But I have a feeling that basically more complicated things becomes easier and more within reach of more people, and people who are truly skilled, it's not a crutch. They get a new tool in their toolbox in order to do what it is that they're doing.
For sure. All right. Well, I think that about wraps us up tonight. Before we go, who should we thank?
Let's thank Ben Katz. Ben Katz.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, editing our show, making sure that we don't sound like total doofuses, and succeeding pretty well. I talked to someone.
I don't know.
I talked to someone today who told me that they only listen to 3 podcasts, and ours is one of them. So I was very flattered by that.
Oh, that's pretty sweet. What are the other 2?
I didn't ask that question. I probably should have.
Oh man,
it's probably
like
Serial Killer's Guide to. No, I don't know what the other things are they listen to, but regardless, I was flattered that we were one of them. So Ben,
yeah, I actually didn't ask you if people go up to you and ask you and recognize your voice from the podcast when they meet you at NAB.
Occasionally it happens, and definitely people see my badge, and I was wearing the podcast badge today, and people did definitely come up to me and wanted to talk to me from that. It doesn't happen every day, it doesn't happen everywhere, but it happens more often than not. So yeah, that's that. A couple times people have recognized me, and I'm like, I don't know who that is, but they knew who I was. So,
all right. Well, let's also go ahead and thank our amazing producer, Alana Cody, who arranged today's interview and many others, and basically all of them. I don't know why I'm talking like that.
98% of them, at least, yeah.
Every once in a while, I'll be like, hey, I know so-and-so. Can we interview them? But it's usually Alana saying, like, hey, we got Randy Tom on here. And you're like, what? How did that happen?
Yeah, indeed. And of course, lastly, never leastly, Al-Atrakchi, who composed all the music you heard in this episode and most every episode. So let's thank Kay.
Every episode, not most every episode, much like Alana.
Ben, where can people find you? They want to find you.
You can find me at benrock.com. You can check out my reel and find all my social media links and go on them, say hi, and be my friend. How about yourself, Ilya? Where can people find you?
Usually you can find me over at Hot Rod Cameras, hotrodcameras.com. Behind the scenes, I am toiling away when I am not, in front of the scenes. But we have had a lot of interesting sort of new marketing sort of stuff happening. And you can find me on the many of those sort of places. So if you're on the Instagram, I'm at Ilya Friedman. Reach out to me on Instagram. That's a place. That's a thing.
If you're on Instagram, you can come look at some of my nauseating AI art experiments.
At Ben Rock? Where is it there?
It's Benjamin_Rock, because when Instagram first came on board, I didn't think it was going to last.
Yeah, I think a lot of us thought that. So.
But you can see happy kids playing in a bouncy house made of meat. That's another one that I have on there.
Mm-mm.
Also, I went through a weird thing where I was like, AI looks like Al, so I would do like AI Pacino or AI Capone. And I posted some of those on there. So it's like Al Pacino is a robot. It's pretty awesome.
Well, that sounds great. Ben, I think that just about does it for this episode. You want to take us out?
Thanks for listening.
This has been the Cinematography Podcast, presented by Hot Rod Cameras. Find your next camera, lens, or accessory on the web at hotrodcameras.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our show on iTunes and connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for listening.